friend Katie Edwards, and Katie is the pastor of junior high ministry at Saddleback Church and has been for how many years?
I've been doing student ministry at Saddleback for 21 years. So it's crazy. We've known each other since I was in high school.
Since high school. And it's been so fun to watch you grow up literally from a young teenage girl to somebody who is on staff, and not just on staff. Katie is a pillar of Saddleback. That'll make me cry. Katie is a pillar of Saddleback Church. She pastored my kids, Amy, Josh, and Matthew, and they were all with Katie. And so Katie is just
And now
amazing.
I have your granddaughter.
And then, and now my granddaughter.
Yeah, which is so fun to have her.
I feel like about 3,000 years old for that to be happening. But, oh gosh.
Yeah.
So Katie has a wealth of experience and knowledge about students and about youth ministry. And some of you are going to want to talk to her afterwards, and we'll tell you how to do that. But we're here today to talk about students and suicide prevention. But what in particular, my story, well, I guess I'll start with my story, just assuming somebody doesn't know. But just in case you don't, our son Matthew, our youngest son, took his life 4 years ago, lived with mental illness from the time he was a very small child, just a little boy. Katie, you knew all of that. And so there's just nothing more tender to me. And I have a passion for preventing suicide in our students, in youth, and even in children. It's unbelievable, but even children take their lives. Just last week, I was working with a family whose 10-year-old tried to kill himself after being bullied at school. And it's real, it happens, and it's a topic we don't really want to talk about because it's painful. Yes. It calls up the darkest both emotions and pain that I think that families can go through. But so that's kind of my story and my passion. Katie, tell us just why this was important for you to talk to me about this today.
Absolutely. Well, I love teenagers. That's my passion and my calling, and I think in our ministries in junior high and high school, and even in college, over the past few years, we've just seen suicide on the rise, unfortunately, whether that's students thinking about it or attempting, or we've had, in the past year, we had 3 middle schoolers in our community who took their own life. Mm-hmm. And so we've just been on this journey of understanding how we as the church can come alongside of families and teenagers, how we can be a safe place to talk about things, tough things, painful things, but also hopefully to be a place of hope where students are receiving the help that they need and the hope that they need. So for us, it's just been a very real thing because we've had kids who are dear to our heart take their own life and experience that through friendship and all of the other relationships. So
So you mentioned that it's on the rise, and just in case you don't know, we live in Orange County, California. There is in Orange County, Florida, but Orange County, California has the very sad distinction of being the county in the United States where the percent of suicides has risen the highest of any other county in the United States between 1999 and 2013. It jumped by 50%. Wow. That's enormous. And so it's very personal here. If you don't know it, there are twice as many suicides in the United States as there are murders. And of course, murder and suicide are the hardest things that any family, any individual has to deal with. But what we don't talk about is that there are twice as many, almost 3 times as many suicides as there are murders in the United States. And it's the second leading cause of death for people 10 to 34. So that encompasses exactly the age that you're working with. So young people between the ages of 10 and 34, it's the number 2 cause of death in the United States. And there are, if there are that many, there's about 44,000 people who died last year to suicide. And if there are 44,000 people who actually completed suicide, took their lives, there are 25 times more people who attempted. So for every person who actually completes suicide, there are 25 people who attempt. And then if you extrapolate beyond that and say there are this many more people who not only maybe they didn't complete it, maybe they didn't actually attempt, but they seriously contemplated taking their lives and began to make a plan. It's a problem that is gigantic. So let's talk just a little bit about maybe some of the myths or misperceptions about suicide.
I think one of the
what are
myths
some of the ones you've heard?
Yeah, with our even with parents, I think a little bit of if we talk about it, then it's going to plant a seed for a student to do that. And I think I can understand the fear behind that.
Oh, I can too.
Absolutely. But I think also creating places where we can talk about it openly, I think that kind of dispels
That's a really
myth.
big one, is that people will always say, well, if I mention the word suicide to my student, to my child, then I'm actually creating, this, they never thought about it before until I used the word. And that isn't so. That's a myth. What about that people who are talking about suicide are doing it to get attention? What would you say? In other words, people will be dismissive and say, oh, they're just trying to get attention. What would you say to that? I think in
teenage culture, that's huge too, right? Mm-hmm. Because teenagers, I mean, let's be honest, have a little bit of a flair for the dramatic at times. And there are times where they expand stories and things like that. And so I think it can be really easy to think for some people that if a teenager expresses that, they're just,
being a drama queen.
Right. They're just being drama. They just want attention. And it's not that never happens, but I think anytime the word suicide is mentioned, there's something behind that.
Yeah, so pay attention to that. The studies show that when people we'll talk about some of the signs in a minute, but when people, let's just say they are expressing and they are being a little dramatic with it, what you need to understand is, as Katie said, there is something beneath that. There is some pain, there is some struggle, some stress that they are dealing with, that they would even bring up that word. So pay attention.
Absolutely.
Far from ignoring, pay attention.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then I think one of the things that I've heard people say, well, they feel helpless, especially as a parent. I know that when Matthew began to talk about suicide, and he was 12, the first time I remember Matthew talking about suicide or suicidal thoughts, he was 12 years old, and it was Mother's Day. And I'll never forget this day because I knew that he was sad. I knew that he was living with depression, but I didn't understand that he was thinking of suicide. And so Mother's Day, I went to say goodnight to him, kind of tuck him in, and as I was leaving his room, he said, "Would you just put me out of my misery and kill me?" And I was so glad that the room was dark because he couldn't see my face, but I was horrified and shocked, and it was just like he might as well have just taken a knife and plunged it in my heart, because to think that my precious 12-year-old was in so much pain that he wanted me to, he didn't say, "I'm going to do it." It was like, could you help me? And that launched a conversation of, well, what is it that you're feeling? Are you thinking of killing yourself? And that began really years and years of Matthew's suicidal ideation. So I know as a mom, I felt helpless, completely unprepared for how I could help my child. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what the faintest thing that I could begin to do. So what are some things maybe that you're learning as a youth pastor and dealing with students? And you have kids of your own. You have kids in this age group yourself. What can parents maybe do if their child says something as painful as that to them?
I think it is really good to understand what the myths are as a parent, because in those helpless moments and in those fearful moments, and we actually do this as parents quite a bit. We push through fears every day, right? So
that's what parenting is.
It basically is pushing through fears on a daily basis with our kids, and this would be another area to push through the fear of, I'm not sure how to bring this up, or how do I have this conversation? And really, it can begin with just some simple questions of, tell me how you're feeling, or tell me what emotions you're feeling right now, and being specific and prompting your kids with some questions. I think it's a place to begin. It's not the whole conversation, but I think as parents, sometimes we just need a starting point in order to help us push through that fear. So in those helpless moments, what are a couple of just specific questions that we could be asking?
And we'll come back to this a little bit in a minute, but I'm also thinking of practical things. If you have a fear that your child your teenager, your student could be thinking about suicide, one of the very practical things you can do is limit their means, their access. I mean, if you have guns in your house, make sure that they are locked away. I mean, maybe if you're willing, give them to a relative somewhere else so they're not even in your house. But if they're in your house, you have to make sure that they are locked and that your student doesn't have access to a weapon, because anytime we make lethal means easy for people living with suicide, it increases the likelihood that they on impulse someday might actually use that gun, or there are other ways. I remember hiding medication in our house and making sure it was in places that it was literally under lock and key, because Matthew had attempted with an overdose. That was his first attempt. And so from then on, medication in our house was not just in the cupboard. It wasn't just in the medicine cupboard anymore. It was in a safe place. It was locked. It was not accessible to him. So one of the things that we can do on that we don't like to talk about this. This is hard stuff. Yeah. But if you have a child or a student who's actively suicidal, you must do what you can to limit the means. And that's one of the things you
Absolutely.
can do.
And I think too, we have to remember our teenagers are still developing. So brains are still developing and some of those things. And so because, especially for middle schoolers, the frontal lobe is still developing, it basically means that they can't control their decisions sometimes. So when you're thinking about where you're giving them freedom, I know as our kids grow up, we get more comfortable with leaving them home alone or leaving them in situations because that is the natural progression. But if you do have your student is struggling or asking these questions, then thinking through someone being at home with them, thinking through limiting some of those freedoms or giving them freedoms with some boundaries. Because of adolescent development and kind of what's happening, some of those things are out of your teenager's hands. Yeah. So helping them to have boundaries and understanding that sometimes, you don't leave your 0 to 2-year-old alone, right? Because they will destroy everything.
They have no concept of safety or
from time to time.
Or risk. Or
maybe
danger.
You don't leave your middle schooler alone or your high schooler alone because they're still working out how to make decisions and choices and some of those things.
That's a really good word. One of the myths that I have heard, not just about students, but about people who take their lives in general is, there were no signs. There were no signs. Nobody saw this coming. And actually, that's pretty well a myth, because people almost always give signs, but we're not always adept at recognizing them. We're not always good at spotting the signs. Matthew, because he lived with chronic suicidality from a very young age, the fact that he died by suicide did not catch me by surprise, because I had known for years and he had attempted. That he died that particular day absolutely shocked me to my core. And the fact that he actually carried it out, that shocked me to my core. But I'm not on the other side of that going, I had no sign, I had no clue. But I've talked to so many people, parents, spouses, friends, who would say, we didn't see it coming. But when we can tease it out backwards, often there are some signs. And so I wanted to just maybe say some of those signs, and you talk about even some what you see in students, because they might look a little different in a student than an adult. But I don't want to scare a parent. I don't want to scare a youth worker, a youth pastor, a youth adult. But this is stuff you do need to know. Sure. Some of the signs for kids who are, or people feeling suicidal, is a change in their behavior. Maybe you have an outgoing student and suddenly they're isolated and they're withdrawn and they don't want to participate in the things that they've been participating. They don't want to go to church. They don't want to go to parties with their friends. They don't want to play video games, or they don't want to participate in their sports. Suddenly there's this change that their behavior, their personality, their thinking starts to change. What are some other things that you've seen in students?
I think, as a youth pastor, we're seeing more of maybe a threat. Sometimes it's even posted on Instagram or it's posted on social media where a student will do a cry for help or make a threat, in public, and I think even just students who would be willing to share with an adult outside of their parent that I'm struggling with suicidal thoughts. So we kind of see, I think, a little bit more of that next step where they're like, I'm thinking about this. Are you an okay person to tell this to? Yeah. Or kind of the threat piece is what we see. We're seeing a lot more on social media, honestly, like where a student will post something or DM something. Yeah. So we're seeing a little bit more of that, I think. That's increased.
Than in years past. I think also some signs that are generally accepted as that are warning signs is if someone maybe starts sleeping too much, or they sleep too little, or they aren't interested in eating, or maybe they're eating too much. So there's weight loss, weight gain, that's not intentional. It's not like somebody, like a teenage girl who's saying, I need to lose 5 pounds before I can go to prom. Not that. It's a loss of interest in food, or maybe just eating too much. Irritability or anger, or just isolating, wanting to stay in their room all the time, not participating in family activities, not participating in social activities. Sometimes, as Katie says, actual threats, or saying, I wish I could die. You know, when people use the phrase, I wish I wasn't here, or I just wish that this would all go away, or I wish that
everybody would be better off,
or everybody,
without me,
oh, that's
or
one,
something like that.
Yeah, if everybody would be better, everybody would just be better off without my drama, without my problems. If I wasn't here, those are warning signs that need to be listened to. And if they happen over a period of weeks, like if your student stops eating, or not sleeping well, or sleeping too much, or isolating, it's not that it happens one time. It's that over a period of a couple of weeks, these changes persist. If they persist over a few weeks or a month, that's the time to get help. That's the time to seek help for your student, for your child. Don't wait around and think that this is just normal teenage behavior. It could be, but on the other hand, you need to pay attention.
Sure, and even when it is normal teenage behavior, you know, when we see big changes in our students and in our kids, it's just a time to ask questions, again, with those starting points.
To press in.
To lean in and not to back off. Sometimes our teenagers are kind of keeping us at arm's length and pushing us back. Every teenage student, as parents, we're the number one influence until at least 19 or 20. And so they might be pushing you back, but there might be those times where you're seeing these signs. And again, those are times to lean in closer, to ask a few more questions, to pay attention to ongoing behavior. I think those things really are things to pay attention to.
Yeah, like I said, when we look back, when someone has taken their lives and it feels like that there were no signs, pretty often there are some things in retrospect. And that can create a lot of guilt in loved ones and in family and friends. And it's not a cause for guilt, because we're all doing the best we can. Sure. But the more educated we are, the more aware we are as coaches, teachers, parents, youth leaders, then the more we can actually be a part of helping students and our children not face these things alone, but to know that they really have allies.
You know, we're seeing too, a lot of students are writing things down. So we, in our church, we have a prayer request card that students can fill out, and every once in a while we get a student who sometimes they're a little bit bolder even in writing. That's why the social media thing, I think, is on the rise, is because they're a little bit more courageous to put thoughts in writing, whether it's online or even times where I've picked up our outline off the floor and I've seen a doodle or something like that. Or a student has written us a note or a letter. So even just paying attention to some of, artwork or letters or writing and things like that. I know students sometimes feel a little bit more courageous in those places.
Yeah, no, that's really good. We're not trying to terrify you and turn you into this person who's just absolutely paranoid and anxiety-ridden over your student or your child, your student. But we're just telling you that it's real and it does happen, and that we have an obligation as people who really love our children, love our students, to just be aware of these things and to not instantly dismiss it as meaningless. It might be, but as Katie says, ask the questions and pay attention. You know, there's some risk factors for suicide. I mean, those are the signs. Some of the things that we talked about are signs of, I meant to say, like increased, like drug use or alcohol use, or if you find your student, suddenly, they've never really gotten involved in drugs or alcohol, but suddenly they're coming home from a party and they're drunk, and or you feel like they're high, or whatever. Those are signs to pay attention to, and not, again, just dismiss them. So some of the risk factors for suicide that put our kids, or put all of us, in that place where we're more vulnerable. If you have, like, some of these can be mental illness, substance use disorder, hopelessness, a history of trauma or abuse, a loss of a loved one, or something that you would particularly see is what they call a cluster of suicides. We're aware of friends who minister in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and in the last, I think it's 18 months, they have experienced the deaths of 30 students, high school students,
Wow.
mostly high school students, to suicide in 18 months in Colorado Springs, which is not a large area. So as they're trying to figure all of that out, students there are actually at a higher risk because there is this cluster of students who are ending their lives, and that does make other students in that area more vulnerable. If there's a loss of a relationship, you know, a friendship, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, maybe parents, or maybe a family breaks up to divorce, maybe there's trauma in the family and abuse or violence, or easy access to lethal means. Kids that are struggling with their sexuality, we know statistically that LGBT students are more vulnerable to suicide, and isolation. So all of those things together can become risk factors for us or for anyone. So if we've talked about this a little, but if you're worried, you know, that your child, your student is depressed and thinking of taking their lives, what are some of the things that a parent or you as a youth pastor, what do you do? How do you step into that space?
You know, as a youth pastor, I think great communication with the parents. So whenever a student, you know, under our care, or a student that we're shepherding is struggling, you know, it's an immediate phone call to their parents, so that hopefully we have a team of people, a village of people rallying around our kids, and that parents don't feel alone.
Yeah.
You know, as parents, I think, you know, we talked about this a little bit about leaning in with your kids and asking questions, but also getting support for you. So having someone who is helping you, you know, praying with you, talking with you, helping you think of what are those great questions to ask, I think those are good places to start.
Yeah. I was thinking of, you know, asking them specifically, not be afraid of the question. I think as parents, maybe as a youth pastor, it's a little bit different. You can be a little more bold and actually say, are you thinking, you know, of killing yourself? Are you thinking of suicide?
Sure.
I think as a parent, that's a terrifying question to think of asking. But as parents, we need to be willing and ready to ask that question and to be able to say, how are you really? I've noticed some changes in your behavior. You don't quite seem yourself, that things are a little off. Are you okay? And if they say, you know, it's just I'm having trouble with my history class, or, you know, I'm really worried about the track meet that's coming up. I'm not sure I'm going to do as well as I hope to do. And, you know, you lean in as a parent and you show support and love. But if that, again, continues, then to actually ask that next question of, are you thinking of taking your life? And are you thinking of suicide? The other thing that we didn't mention that happens and is a warning sign is self-harm. Cutting or burning, or kids who maybe have an eating disorder. I mean, some of those things are warning signs. They're signs of pain. They're signs of that everything's not okay inside this child, inside this student. So to actually ask that question, and if they say yes, don't freak out. Don't say, well, don't do that. I mean, the last thing you want to say is, don't do that. Don't you dare do that. Don't you dare, you know, kill yourself and leave me. I mean, that's what we feel like as parents. But what we need instead is to be calm and to say, man, that I love you so much. We're going to get some help. And to actually then seek out help, talk to your doctor, get an evaluation, talk to your youth pastor. Make sure that you as a parent don't brush that off out of your fear, or even out of your busyness.
Yeah.
I have to, I mean, I talked to an adult, a parent, last year who was concerned about her child, and her comment to me was, you know, my son is really struggling, and he's on medication. And I said, so how's he doing? Is he compliant? Is he taking his medication? And she said, you know, I can't believe she said this, but she said, I'm too busy to check to see if he's taking his medication. And there was really a part of me that wanted to grab her by the shoulders and shake her and say, are you kidding me? You're too busy to check to see if your student that you know, your son that you know is struggling, you're too busy to check and see if he's taking his medication. I wanted to say, hey, I've lost a kid. Don't do this. Don't let your child be alone in his struggle. If you are too busy to monitor, to check, to be that engaged with your student, you need to do some business with God. You're too busy. Your life is out of control if you are too busy to know what's going on with your kid. I don't know. I really did. There was a urge in me, and it was not a good one. I was so angry, and I was so shocked. I didn't really know how to respond. But now just talking about it again, I'm going to go back and talk to her and say, you know what, please don't. Please let your child know. If something happens to your child, you will regret it the rest of your life that you were too busy to know what was going on with him.
I think as parents, I mean, that's a great point for us to think through our time and being intentional and being thoughtful about when we're checking in. You know, with our teenagers, when sometimes things are on a normal track of they're struggling with something, just thinking through even changing the setting, not necessarily, choosing when you're going to have these conversations and ask these questions. So sometimes when the morning times and we're in the hustle of the morning, that might be a tough time to have that conversation, right? Because we're in that mode of hustle.
Gotta get to school.
Right,
You're looking at your watch.
And from a mom who's late every day, I totally get that. But, understanding, I'm going to carve out time in the afternoon where I know things are not in a hustle, or after dinner when things feel like they settle down. Even being choosy about times to be intentional and thoughtful with our kids, I think really helps it become something, again, a little bit more thoughtful versus, are you okay? Are you doing okay?
Right.
Did you take your meds? Did you take your meds? Because we all understand that as family, the hustle of family, right? So what does it look like in, just as a youth worker or as a parent to kind of think through, when am I going to ask these intentional questions? And maybe it is sitting on the edge of the bed at night. That tends to be when I have my most meaningful conversations with my kids.
They want to spill their guts,
and
at
sometimes
midnight.
they're like, "Mom, get out,"
Yeah.
But really kind of thinking through your day as a mom or as a dad, and thinking through, when can I connect back with them? If they're lethargic, if they are depressed, if they are sleeping a lot, you might need to go into their space in order to have those conversations. Or it might be, we're going to go for a drive. Sometimes when I put a kid in the back seat of my car, we have our best conversations when we're not looking at each other. But there's some honesty there.
Agree.
So sometimes
you're captive audience.
Sometimes that especially for the younger ones, a middle schooler, I would suggest that of sometimes, hey, do you want to go for a drive for 30 minutes? And I know this great coffee shop. Let's just go grab one and come back. So most of your time's in the car. So even just being thoughtful about space and environment and places that you can draw your teenager into conversation, and again, sometimes you might need to go into their space if it is getting really low.
They're withdrawing and isolating. Yeah. So Katie, as a youth pastor, how have you taken all of this? What's happened? The students that we've lost, the students that are vulnerable right now. What have you at Saddleback in our junior high ministry, middle school? What have you done to intentionally, reach out and have some of these conversations?
Yeah. I think, one of the things that I love about our church, Saddleback in general, is I feel like we are able to take some things that are happening in the big church, which is what we call it, where adults are, and then kind of gear that down for our high school and junior hires. By no means is it watered down. It's just geared for our age groups. But I think our church has been in process and on this journey of opening up the conversation of mental health and mental illness, and then suicide, and talking about these things with our students. It's not a weekly thing that we present from the front, but it is something that we have trained our small group leaders to talk about. Any students or any leaders who are discipling kids, it's a conversation that we have been in as a leadership team, just making sure that we have open avenues to see signs, to understand where our students are at, ask good questions, and hopefully come alongside of parents. So I think just opening up the topic and the conversation. Again, I think as a youth pastor, you have to push through your fears sometimes. Okay, there are lovelier things to talk about, but this is definitely something that's real for our students, and we want to be where they're at. I think the other thing that we've noticed is we really also want to be this really loud voice of hope.
I love that.
So
you told me that earlier. I'm like, I love that. Say that again. I mean, I just love that.
Totally. Our students what's in their focus right now is a lot of negative, dark stuff. And so stuff they're soaking in on social media, in their isolation, in their self-absorption, in the programming for our students, it's dark. And I think, I think sometimes there are even these messages of we need to be kind to each other, we need to treat each other well. And so there's some of those messages out there, but the message of hope is quiet.
Yeah.
And so I think for our youth ministry, we really want to be a loud voice for the hope in Jesus. We want to be a loud voice for God's goodness, for the joy in this world. We want our actions to overflow out of those things. So I really, as a youth pastor this next year, we want to be a safe place to talk about these things where students are struggling and be in that place. But we also want to be this really just boisterous voice for hope.
And tell us how you've done that in practical terms. How have you devised that even in programming for students?
Well, we took just a first step this weekend. So there was a program that was on Netflix called 13 Reasons Why. And I that blew up in our teenage culture. So there's so many students talking about that. And
just for the person who lives under a rock and doesn't know what that is, just in a sentence, what is 13 Reasons Why?
So it's basically a show about a girl who took her own life. And each episode is she basically makes a videotape for a person who has hurt her, and it's kind of they contributed to her suicide. Yeah. And it's dark. Yeah. I mean, it's dark and it's graphic.
And students have responded to it. I mean, the intention of it from the producers was to incite conversations about suicide. Mm-hmm. You and I both think that while I honor that intention, I think that it is actually pretty dangerous for students, particularly vulnerable students, to watch. So your sermons this weekend was not on that show.
Actually,
it was a response.
We didn't talk about the show at all.
Right.
When I watched the first episode, my heart was just aching because I thought, wow, so many students are soaking in the darkness, the vengeance of this episode, and I just really wanted an antidote for that, for students to understand that there is hope, that God does care about you, you do matter, you were created for a purpose. And so we did our sermon this weekend was 13 Reasons Why There's Hope. And we just had different people kind of sharing all of these different things, that you are seen, you are loved, that Jesus is walking with you, that he's actually walked in your shoes and felt your pain. And I just wanted students to understand that, yes, there is hope.
So if a youth pastor wanted to see that, where would they find it?
It's on YouTube. And it's also on our website, saddlebackjhm.com. So you can check that out.
Saddleback
JHM, juniorhighministry.com.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yes.
No, that's okay. I
said it so fast, just rattled it off. But I think just in response to, I think all of it's easier for our students to soak in the negative stuff.
Sure.
It's easier for them to soak in the dark stuff and in their because relationships are so much more isolated with social media, right? So they're by themselves a lot more, it feels like. And so they're soaking in this stuff by themselves. Mm-hmm. And so how do we become this loud voice of helping them understand, gosh, no, there's so much hope.
There is hope. So, and also tell them about the Anchored Weekend. If somebody if you wanted in your church to start talking about mental illness and you don't even know where to begin this conversation, we were also in that same place. We had to start somewhere.
Absolutely.
And so tell them about how we started.
A couple years ago.
I'm taking credit. How you started.
No, together we did it. A few years ago, as our church really began this conversation and really began talking about it in the adult circles, we really wanted this to be a conversation in the or in our circle with teenagers. And so we did a weekend called Anchored, and it really was just an introduction and an opening to the conversation about mental health. So helping students feel like no matter what they were struggling with, that there were places for them to go, something for us to point them to, and ways for us to encourage them. And honestly, we had such a great response to that first weekend of students feeling so...
I just happen to have it right here.
That was very
Wasn't
smooth.
that great that I just kind of put that in there? This DVD?
Smooth. Yeah, totally.
Yes.
But it really, like he said, we're in process and learning and on the journey, so we definitely don't have all of this figured out. And as culture moves quicker, we're trying to move with it. But I think this Anchored Weekend was just a great first step.
There were messages. There were on this DVD, which is available at kwarren.com, also at pastors.com. It's the messages that you gave at both high school and in our senior high ministry, And in our senior high ministry, our college pastor, who was on one of these Facebook Lives, talking about living with mental illness, he talked to the students that he lives with bipolar, and so he was himself a testimony, but we also have students who talked about living with mental illness. So there's games, there's graphics, there's student video, there's the message videos, and so this is a great tool for you to have if you want to launch this conversation about mental illness in your church.
And it was really great for us because I think then it also caused us as leadership to continue that conversation and to think through how do we continue to minister to students who are struggling in all different ways.
Yeah. So I'm going to give you a hotline number that you need to know if you have students or for anyone. This is not just for students. This is for anyone who might be feeling suicidal. It's 1-800-273-TALK, T-A-L-K. Hotline number. It's available 24/7 anywhere in the United States. Also, there is a text crisis line, and it's 741-741, and then you put the word home in the body of your text, and that's a text crisis line. At my website, kwarren.com/suicide prevention, a lot of resources, videos you can watch, links to other organizations that work in suicide prevention, PDFs that you can download for maybe somebody who's attempted suicide, for a family who has lost someone to suicide. There are links where you can get training if you want to get more training about equipping yourself to really be able to help people prevent suicide. That's at kwarren.com/suicide prevention. So Katie, as we close this out, what's one or two thoughts you would share with anybody who maybe is having suicidal thoughts, or maybe feeling like maybe they have a plan, maybe they're just thinking about it, maybe they're just at that place of deep depression where it's like, maybe the world would be better off without me. What would you say?
I mean, I think a couple things. Number one, I would say talk to someone immediately. I think when we are alone and in isolation and left with just our own thoughts, I think that's a place where Satan attacks us and just feeds us lie after lie. And I think when we are around others who know us and love us, those people are telling us the truth. Obviously God's word and scripture is a place to find truth that feeds into us and fills us up, and allow people who are connected to scripture to breathe that into you if you can't breathe it in yourself. To allow that to overflow out of others' hearts into you. So my main encouragement would be to find one person or a couple of people that you can just talk to and be honest with.
I would echo that, and I say this all the time. We all struggle. Please don't struggle alone. We all struggle, but don't struggle alone. So if you are feeling at that place of deep depression, despair, wondering if you should go on, it's just understand that there are people around you who do love you, and take that struggle and bring it to them. I would also say to ride the wave, because the feelings of wanting to die are strong, they are powerful, and they are as powerful as a wave that can knock you down. But those waves do come and go. And so if you can ride that wave and not give in to the power of that wave, of the impulsivity of, this is what I'm feeling right now, so I have to do something about it. It is a wave that will pass. And ride it, not alone, but with other people. Don't be alone. Do not be by yourself. Call one of these hotlines if you don't feel like there's somebody in your life that you can talk to. There are people that you can reach out to. And I would say, the last thing I would say is that there is always hope. There is always hope. There is always another day. There is a better future for you. There is a bright future. God loves you, and you are cared for. You belong. You matter. You are needed in this world, and we want you to stay. God wants you to stay. And if you want to talk to Katie and some of the others on her team, you can go to their website again, which is Saddleback, JHM.com. And we're so grateful that you listened, and we're in this together. We're in this together so that more people will be able to choose life and choose hope.